We have a wonderful slate of presenters today. The first that we're going to introduce is Allison Smith. Allison is an engineering consultant for CTE, Center for Transportation and the Environment. She provides project management and technical support for battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicle deployments. Also from CTE is Taylor Patel. Taylor is the outreach coordinator. She assists with and coordinates CTE's membership management, zero-emission bus resource alliance activities, general CTE communications, and provides administrative services for 2 zero-emission bus deployment projects. During the webinar, you'll hear more about CTE and what they do. Our next speaker, Jason White, is a multimodal transit planner for the Roaring Fork Transportation Authority, also known as RFTA, which operates a variety of transit and trail services across a 70-mile rural service region in western Colorado. RFTA employs 380 people, operates 90 revenue buses, and in 2018, their system-wide ridership was 5.1 million. Our last presenter is Chris Bilby. He is a research and programs engineer with Holy Cross Energy, also known as HCE, a not-for-profit, member-owned electric cooperative utility providing electricity, energy products, and services to more than 43,000 members in western Colorado. Mr. Bilby supports the power supply and department by studying and planning for the increasing number of distributed energy resources and their effects on system loading and load profiles. So with that, I am going to change the presenter. And we will start the CTE part of the webinar. Everybody should see the CTE webinar on their screen now.
Oh, all right. So sorry about the issues there. So this is Allison Smith with CTE. Thank you so much, Kara, for giving us this opportunity to present on zero-emission vehicles and strategies for working on your with your electric utility. So I'm going to hand the speaking role over to my colleague Taylor Patel. For the start of this presentation, we'll swap back and forth a little bit as we go. And please feel free to submit questions through the chat box as we go. We try to build this presentation to leave plenty of time for that kind of dialogue. So with that, I will hand it over to Taylor.
Hey everyone. This is a brief agenda of the topics that we will be reviewing today. We'll cover who CT is and the work that we do. We'll provide a brief overview of the zero-emission transit industry and discuss various vehicle technologies and their associated fueling approaches. We will review electricity usage for transit fleets, specifically potential electricity usage and load profiles. Then there will be a case study presentation with Roaring Fork and Holy Cross, and then we will discuss what steps you can take to partner with utilities in your service territory. So a little bit about CTE. We are the Center for Transportation and the Environment. We're a nonprofit organization with a mission to improve the health of our climate and communities by bringing people together to develop and commercialize clean, efficient, and sustainable transportation technologies. In general, we provide engineering and project management consulting services for organizations, agencies, and similar entities that are looking to deploy zero-emission vehicles. We do this by providing 4 service areas. Our first service area is prototype development and demonstration. So we find funding for and manage technology research, development, and demonstration programs. We also provide smart deployment services where we help with the initial zero-emission vehicle deployment, or what you would think of as the pilot deployment. Our third service area is fleet transitioning. So we provide planning services for organizations looking to go 100% zero emission. And then we also provide education, outreach, and advocacy. So we advocate for zero emission technology on various government levels and provide educational services. We have 4 offices across the country. We're headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia, and we have regional offices in St. Paul, Minnesota, Berkeley, California, and Los Angeles, California. This map is showing the different projects we have across the United States. As you can see, we work all over the country, providing us experience in different climates, geopolitical areas, communities, and more. You will see the green dots represent our zero-emission bus deployment projects, and the yellow dots represent our zero-emission bus transitioning planning projects. So we will have a few polling questions throughout the webinar. This is polling question number 1. Do you operate any electric vehicles? Select all that apply to you.
I guess, do we?
We had 21% with buses, 8% with light-duty vehicles, and 75% no.
Okay.
Great. So now we'll walk through an overview of the zero-emission transit industry. There are a lot of benefits to deploying zero-emission vehicles. For instance, they have lower emissions, which provides public health benefits due to cleaner air. They're more efficient, they're cleaner and quieter to operate, and they have lower operating costs. We want to note that there are a lot of caveats around them being cheaper to operate. This really depends on the utility rate structure in your area and how the buses are operated, which makes it critical to having conversations with your utility at an early stage in the deployment process. Before we dive into these statistics, we do want to note that we are focusing on 40-foot on the 40-foot bus market because it's so advanced compared to the other electric vehicle markets. But the other electric vehicle markets or vehicles will be touched on later in this presentation. So currently over 1,600 ZEBs have been sold or ordered in 44 of the US states. This is a combination of battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell buses. Due to this, various regulations and incentives are cropping up in regards to deploying electric vehicles. There are federal grant programs available to support ZEB deployments. California is requiring that transit agencies have 100% zero-emission bus fleets by 2040. We do want to note that this requirement is currently only for 40-foot buses because the other vehicles are not commercially available yet. As soon as they are commercially available, they will start to be included in this regulation. Now we will review some of the zero-emission buses available. First, we have the long-range battery electric bus. These buses are designed to operate for most of the day without needing intermittent charging. Charging does typically take 4 to 6 hours to go from empty to full, and you'll usually see these used in tandem with plug-in chargers at the depot. The second type of bus is a fast charge battery electric bus. These buses have smaller battery packs than the longer range buses, but they charge faster. They are oftentimes utilized for longer service days because they are topped off or charged at certain stops along their service path. And usually these buses are paired with on-route overhead or inductive chargers. In regard to the different types of charging equipment, we first have a plug-in charger. They tend to be lower powered and each dispenser is paired with one bus. This one-for-one pairing may not be the case in the future. In addition to that, if you have the staffing capacity, you can also swap fully charged buses out with lower battery buses to have more buses utilizing one dispenser. There can be space constraints due to this one-to-one ratio of the bus to the plug-in charger. And power upgrades will most likely be needed, making it critical that you have discussions with your utility. The second charger option is an overhead charger. So you have a pantograph up, which is seen in the first smaller picture, and a pantograph down, which is seen in the second larger picture. On the pantograph up side, on the pantograph up charger, the charging equipment is located within the bus, and on the pantograph down, the charging equipment is located within the overhead charger. When planning for these chargers and other on-route chargers, it's important to consider if you own the land you're trying to install the charger on. Maintenance is also a very important consideration to keep in mind because there is a single point of failure, which means if the charger goes down, it can affect service on that route compared to having multiple plug-in chargers at the depot. The third charging option is an inductive charger, or known as a wireless charger. These have similar planning considerations as the overhead chargers. It's important to note that aligning the bus with the charger pad is critical. Having a slightly off alignment can reduce the efficiency of the charging power. So one of the biggest questions that transit agencies need to answer is where will the charging equipment be located? This picture is pretty representative of a standard bus parking situation at a transit agency, as in there's not a lot of room to put extra equipment. This can really impact the type of charger you select and the infrastructure you install. Your utility can help with the infrastructure planning depending on how they pull the electrical work. It's critical to keep in mind that range is variable with zero-emission buses depending on a variety of factors. You do not want to rely solely on the technical specification for the projected range. Range will be impacted by route characteristics, ridership, heating in the winter and cooling in the summer, battery degradation over the life of the battery, unusable battery energy, and operator behavior or how the bus is driven.
And these are all things that can be, this is Allison, taking back over the presentation for a little bit. So I just want to mention that there are a lot of things that impact range on these vehicles, and it is important to understand those factors, but those are all things that can be understood and worked around once you know how the vehicle fits in your service. It's just another reason to do a lot of upfront analysis and planning before you get vehicles, so that you're prepared when you have those vehicles and there's a really cold day or a really hot day, that you know how it's going to respond and whether or not it'll impact your service. So it would be remiss of us to not mention the other electric bus, as we like to call it, hydrogen fuel cell electric. So we won't spend a whole lot of time on these vehicles in this presentation, but there are a couple of interesting things about them. I think of fuel cell buses as basically a battery bus with a hydrogen fuel cell range extender. It's the same in terms of it has an electric drive motor, it's a zero emission vehicle, but you have this addition of a fuel cell and hydrogen tanks, and often what that means is basically you have a longer range than you do with a pure battery electric vehicle. And there are some different things with the fueling. But even if you are looking at the fuel cell route, it's still really important to talk with your electrical utility, because there are some electrical requirements with fuel cell infrastructure as well. So a hydrogen fueling station is a picture from the bottom right. It's from SARTA in Canton, Ohio. It looks pretty similar to a standard diesel or CNG vehicle or fueling station. So they can be sited much more similarly. It's a very different problem than when you're looking at charging infrastructure. Permitting can be a little bit of a challenge sometimes. Hydrogen is a new type of vehicle fuel for a lot of city jurisdictions, and so there's a lot of conversations that need to be had around that. Some of the advantages over charging infrastructure is often today when people are deploying chargers, they end up deploying one charger per bus, basically. So if they're getting 5 buses, they're getting 5 chargers, or maybe they'll get 6 so that they have one as backup. But then when they want to get 5 more buses, then they have to put in 5 more chargers. With a fueling station, if you're going to go to all the effort to put in a fueling station, you might as well put in a bigger one to begin with, because it's not, the incremental cost is not as great. So then when SARTA likes to brag about how they have 7 fuel cell buses, and for their next 5 that they want to get, they don't have to make any infrastructure changes. And these vehicles do have shorter fueling times as well. It's much more similar to CNG than the 4 to 6 hour overnight charging you'd be looking at with a long range battery electric bus. These stations do have higher electrical requirements than a typical diesel station. So if we're looking at fueling 12 buses, we might be looking at 150 kilowatts of extra power to power the compressors and the dispenser and the other equipment, which is about equivalent to a depot charger in the garage. So just to put that in context. And then there's also opportunities to do on-site hydrogen generation. Some of the partners we have are very interested in this because they want to be able to just make their fuel on site. And one of the ways to do that is through electrolysis. So basically you take electricity and water, you run it through an electrolyzer, and you get hydrogen out. But those electrolyzers can use quite a lot of electricity. Looking at a 12 bus fueling station, you might need a megawatt of power, which is a pretty significant power requirement. And again, another motivator to engage your electrical utility as early as possible. So that's a little bit about fuel cells. I do want to talk about other vehicles. I know a lot of people on the call operate vehicles besides 40-foot buses. And one of the things to think about when you're thinking about infrastructure, especially if you have a fleet with mixed vehicle types, is some of the components may be different depending on what kind of vehicle you have. So on the battery electric side, charging connectors is one of the first things that comes to my mind. I think a lot of people are aware that like a Tesla, for example, has a different charger than a Chevy Bolt. And so the same thing might be true with if you have some light duty vehicles and you have some 40-foot buses. And so a charger that works for one vehicle might not work for another. Kind of similarly, the battery specifications are going to be different. They'll have different voltages, they'll have different currents that they're capable of carrying, and so those are just some things that you'll need to keep in mind as you're installing infrastructure, is whether or not it's interoperable with the different vehicles that you would be looking at procuring in the future. On the fuel cell side, there are other things that are different between different types of vehicles. So light duty vehicles have 700 bar tanks pressure, whereas heavy duty buses have 350 bar pressure. So they have different fueling protocols basically and equipment, different compressors are needed, that kind of thing, for the two different types of vehicles. The receptacles may be different, and also related pre-cooling requirements may be different. So just keep in mind that whatever infrastructure you're putting in, it really depends on the types of vehicles that you will be procuring. So in terms of talking about other types of vehicles, I know cutaways are one that we get asked about a lot. And unfortunately, the vehicle development is just not as far along in commercialization as 40-foot buses are, or cars. And part of the reason for this is that you have a vehicle that still has pretty significant power requirements and high idle load, so there can be a lot of energy used during stops, but you've got a smaller vehicle and you're kind of running out of space where to put the batteries. So it's been a difficult engineering challenge, but people are working on it, and there have been some electric cutaways. I believe Phoenix Motors just announced that they delivered an electric shuttle a couple of months ago. There's also Lightning Systems and Motive Power Systems are definitely interested in this market. They're starting to get these vehicles approved for some of the California voucher programs and that sort of thing. So these vehicles are coming, and they should be available soon. They're just not quite there yet. We don't have quite the same experience with them that we do with 40-foot buses. In terms of vans, again, there are a lot of people that are interested in these vehicles. I know Ford has announced one. The Mercedes has announced the Sprinter, an electric version of that vehicle. In kind of on a similar size, but somewhat different vehicles, UPS and FedEx are looking at their testing electric delivery vans. They're also looking very closely at fuel cell for their applications. So those, again, people are gonna make this vehicle. They're just not quite ready yet. And then on cars, you've got quite a few options. On the electric side, we've got Teslas, the Chevy Bolt, Nissan Leaf. On the fuel cell side, the Toyota Mirai is the one that is most common. You will only see that in California at this point, at least on the residential market, because that's the only place there are fueling stations. But if you are interested in going that route, that is a vehicle that is out there and well proven. So talked a lot about the different kinds of vehicles that are out there. And so now I want to kind of shift focus from the vehicles to thinking about yourselves as electricity consumers. So electric vehicles use a lot of electricity, and it takes a lot of power to fuel those vehicles, especially the closer you want to get to a one-to-one replacement in terms of fueling times. I don't know that we'll ever get quite there, but the closer you get, the more power you need. So you have to start thinking of yourselves as electricity consumers, and managing your fuel costs is going to be a very different exercise than it is with diesel or CNG. So we'll talk a little bit about electricity costs. But first, polling question number 2. Have you met with your local utility to talk about electric vehicles? We can take this question while we're... We did get a question, and I'll just address it while you guys fill out the poll, about waste to energy, basically. So burning garbage to create EVs, and I don't think there's not a whole lot of waste to energy plants in the United States at this point. I think Minneapolis has one, but they're shutting it down because a lot of people aren't necessarily a fan of that. I know there are a lot of conversations about, like, well, is it really cleaner to drive an electric vehicle than to use in a vehicle that's been powered by the grid? We've got a lot of coal. Taylor and I are in Minnesota. I'm not sure if that was mentioned, but there is a lot of coal on our grid. Is it really cleaner? And no matter where you are in the U.S., it's still cleaner than driving a fossil fuel powered vehicle directly. You also have to think about what the electricity and the energy that goes into making that diesel and getting it to your facility. So once you take all those things into account, electric vehicles are still cleaner.
Okay, this is a close poll. 39% voted yes, 58% voted no, and 3% voted I don't know.
All right, so that's great that some of you are already starting along this process to talk with your utility. And there are a lot of great reasons to talk with your utility. There's a lot of opportunities for both utilities and transit agencies and other fleet operators to benefit from a stronger relationship. So some of these things are a little bit more on the utility side, but the electrical grid and managing demand is a really key challenge for utilities, and transit agencies can help with that challenge. There's an opportunity here to make operational and infrastructure improvements. If you are upgrading the grid, you may end up with some newer equipment. I mean, there's opportunities here. And especially doing long-term planning to support long-term transportation electrification. You can, by looking at that long-term scale that utilities and transit agencies are used to when you're procuring 12-year vehicles or you're procuring substation equipment that you're going to operate for a very long time, you can make those steps now to make things better today that will last you for a very long time. There's good opportunities for education and understanding of the different constraints that each of you are under and the service you're trying to provide. There's opportunities to meet carbon emission reduction goals. Utilities are working on making their systems greener, and we're also working on the transportation side and reducing emissions and improving local public health. And then resilience is also key. This is a big question that transit agencies are asking. Like, we know that agencies are important providers of services to communities, especially during emergency situations. And you need to be able to drive your vehicles when the power is out. And so working with the utility to figure out how to continue to provide that service when there is an emergency is important. So one of the key things in this conversation is getting to understand what they need and making sure that you're able to successfully communicate what you need. So one of the key things that utilities are under is demand, basically, where there are certain times of day where everybody wants power, and it's harder for the utilities to give you power at that time. So a lot of times transit agencies will say that they need to charge, right when the buses get back, and that might be a really hard time for the utility to provide electricity. And so they may ask, like, if you could just wait 2 hours, if you could just wait 2 hours, that would really avoid our peak time, and maybe we can do something with you from a price standpoint to adjust that by asking you to wait 2 hours to charge your vehicles. So when you're talking to them about trying to understand what their needs are, it's important to ask about what the things are that impact your electric bill, and then what kinds of short and long-term infrastructure plans do they have? How can they support you as you're looking at electrifying your fleet? So I put this slide up, and it's calling it a simple electric grid. And what I really want to just show here is just a little bit of the complexity behind where our electricity comes from. So there's a lot of different steps in the process, and different utilities are responsible for different components of this process. Some are responsible for the whole chain, some are responsible for just pieces of it. So it starts with generation, whether that's a coal plant, a nuclear plant, a wind farm, a solar farm. You've got somewhere where you're making the electricity, and then you're transmitting it sometimes really far distances with really large power lines to a substation where the power is transferred onto the distribution system, which are smaller power lines, and then it goes to the consumer where you can charge your vehicle. And the utilities that run the different components of this, and I'm very simplifying this here, but there are different types of utilities, and I want to just mention the kind of the different types because your relationship with your utility will be in some ways affected by the type of utility that you're working with. So investor-owned utilities are very common in large cities and a number of other locations. They are subjected to quite a lot of review by the State Public Utility Commission for the most part, and there can be really long processes. If they want to do an EV rate program or something like that, it could take a couple of years for it to go through that process. Again, another reason to engage with your utility early is because it takes them time to make decisions, just as it takes a long time to go from issuing an RFP to having a vehicle delivered on site. So there's investor-owned utilities, there are municipal utilities, they are owned and operated by the city, and then there are cooperative utilities. Those are member-owned. They have oftentimes an elected board that is responsible for overseeing the utility's decisions, and they're nonprofit organizations. They operate very differently than an investor-owned utility. So when you're talking with other transit agencies as well about how they work with their utility, that might be a question that you want to ask, is what kind of utility are they working with versus what kind you are working with. And I just want to talk just a little bit more about utilities, some of the different terms you'll hear. So when you're looking at long-term infrastructure, I think one of the things that may come up is single phase versus three-phase power. So single phase power, it can't carry quite as much energy basically as a three-phase power system might. And so if you have a smaller facility at this point, you may be on a single phase feed, but to put in a 120 kilowatt car or bus charger, you will need to go up to three-phase 480 volt and put in a new transformer. So that's something that your utility will do for you, is bump you up to three-phase if that's what you need to charge your vehicles. So one of the things to consider in terms of infrastructure upgrades. And then we talk a little bit about pricing, because that's one of the key things. Everyone says electric vehicles are cheaper, and sometimes they are, and unfortunately sometimes they are not. But there are things that you can do to impact what that cost is going to be, and one of the key things is understanding energy versus demand. So your utility bill will often be made of, there'll be energy charges, and there'll be demand charges, and then there'll be a couple of other things. So energy you can think of as kind of the amount of energy in your tank. Or the amount of gas in your tank, basically. It's measured in kilowatt hours, and it's the amount of energy that you use. Demand is how fast you fuel your vehicle. So if you have 2 chargers on, you're using twice as much power as if you only had 1 charger on. And the demand for your electricity bill is based on the highest amount of power you asked for, usually in any 15-minute window in an entire month. So if you have 5 chargers and you turn them all on at once and you only do it 1 time, your demand is still going to be based off of having all 5 of those chargers on at once. So one of the things that is key to managing your electric bill is limiting what that demand is. So these charts on the bottom give an example of, on the left, you've got a transit agency who's doing their service. When they bring their buses back, they plug them in and they start charging them because they want to get them recharged. And you can see there's a lot of buses that come back in near the end of the day, and there's this huge spike in power. But if they had a little bit of charge management, so instead of charging the buses at the moment they come back to the garage, they charge them in a strategy where they minimize the number of buses they have charging at once, but they still get them all recharged before they have to go out the next morning. You can basically cut that demand in half. And the demand being a pretty significant part of your electric bill, if you can cut that in half, that does great things for your cost per mile. So this is one of the reasons that CTE strongly recommends that you look at modeling what your electric bill is going to be before you deploy vehicles, so that you can make decisions on how much you should invest in charge management software. Can you save a fair amount of money by managing your demand, or does it not impact you so much because of the way your bill is structured? Does it make more sense for you to run your bus all day, or does it make sense to come back and charge midday because maybe electricity is cheaper than if you've got a lot of solar on the grid? So this is just a general good practice when you're getting ready to deploy electric vehicles. And then this is a measure that we use to look at whether or not how much your vehicles cost to operate, and checking whether or not your electric vehicles are cost competitive with diesel. Because we'll hear transit agencies go and talk, they'll get their first electric bill, they'll be like, oh my goodness, this is so high. They'll go to their utility and they'll say, this is too expensive. And it's like, well, that's true, but it's not, it doesn't give you kind of concrete quantitative things to work with. And measuring your cost per mile in diesel is a great way to do that, because if you've had people say you should go electric, it's way cheaper than diesel, you need to be able to show if it's not, and you need to work with your utility on kind of a rate that maybe works better for you, this is the way to do it. And you can also see that the electric bill, this is actual data from an actual transit agency, and their cost per mile for their electric fleet, it varies seasonally. During some of the times of the year where they don't have to use as much HVAC, it can be really cheap to run those vehicles compared to diesel. In other times of the year, it's not. So you can't just take like a month snapshot and use that as your metric. You really have to look at it over time to compare with diesel. All right, so with that, I will stop talking for a little bit, and I will hand the speaking roles over to Jason and Chris to talk about their experiences working together on Roaring Fork's electric bus deployment.
Okay, so we're going to change the presenter.
Great, we're here to share our experience on how a rural transit authority teamed up with a rural electric co-op to bring battery electric buses to our area. My name is Chris Bilby. I'm a research and programs engineer at Holy Cross Energy, and with me today is
Jason White, and I'm a multimodal transit planner for the Roaring Fork Transportation Authority.
What does multimodal mean, Jason?
Any way to get people around.
Oh, that's great.
Different modes.
Tell us a little bit about your territory.
So RFTA is unique. We're a regional transportation authority. We are the second largest transit agency in the state of Colorado behind RTD and Denver, and we are the largest rural transit agency in the U.S. We cover about 70 miles and large portions of 3 counties. We have 8 member jurisdictions, and you can see up here, I won't go through every single bullet, but to kind of put this in perspective, we have about 90 revenue vehicles right now, 34 are compressed natural gas. I'll talk more about the 8 battery electric buses in our pilot. But one thing I wanted to point out here for this conversation is that we span 4 utilities. So we pay electric bills to 4 different utilities, and Holy Cross is a rural co-op, and they're one of them. And so that's kind of what the connection to this exact conversation is.
Yeah, so Holy Cross is one of the 4 utilities that provides electricity to RFTA. We also have one other transit authority, Eagle County Transit, that we're looking at a project next year to bring 3 buses to their territory. We span a lot of the I-70 corridor in the western slopes of Colorado from Vail to Rifle, and then we also serve Highway 82, which is a lot of RFTA's route from Glenwood Springs to Aspen. Great, Jason. So why did RFTA want to electrify part of their fleet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our board of directors has always been very innovative and very tapped into environmental sustainability. Also, our ridership has kind of seen RFTA been early adopters of different technologies over the year, running biodiesel, compressed natural gas, hybrid electric, and then now dabbling in all battery electric. And with this slide up, I'll just kind of breeze through some of this. We've been scoping this project, I guess you could say, for a little over 2 years. And we were lucky enough to have Chris and Holy Cross at the table as early as January of 17. We had a charrette, and we had a lot of the electric bus vendors come and a lot of regional stakeholders. We ended up going through a competitive RFP process. New Flyer is our partner, and we are using ABB depot chargers. And as of right now, we are not using on-route chargers. However, we will be doing an evaluation study of our pilot project, and we intend to eventually use an on-route or a couple of on-route chargers. But because we cover such a large distance, we need to be very strategic about that. And also with a big one here is the shared sustainability goals with Holy Cross. That we are helping each other kind of move our electrification goals forward.
So, Jason, 8 buses, this seems like a lot for your first pilot. How did you end up on 8?
Yeah, and so that was a big conversation we had internally. We wanted to buy enough buses that we had a little economy of scale to where it wasn't just a one-off kind of special project. So we felt like buying 8 of them was significant enough for our operations and maintenance departments to treat them with respect and also to integrate them into all of our routes as much as possible, which we are working on testing them right now.
Yeah, I know for us, we've been in also communication with Eco Transit, not as long as with RFTA here, and the town of Vail's also looking at electrifying their fleet. Are there any other ones in the area? Not the size of RFTA.
There are a couple other mountain agencies on the western slope of Colorado, and a couple that jump to mind, Eco Transit, Summit Stage, and they are getting 1 or 2 at a time, Breckenridge as well. But RFTA is by far the largest with the 8 in our pilot project. So one thing, a question I want to ask you, Chris, is I often hear you say that there is a synergy with renewable energy and plug-in electric vehicles. So how does RFTA's project, us plugging our buses into your grid, how does that help you with your sustainability goals?
Yeah, so we set a sustainability goal last year of 70-70-30 plan. So we wanted to provide 70% of our energy from renewable energy, reduce our greenhouse gases by 70%, and do this at no additional cost to our power supply. And we're going to try to do this all by 2030. Part of that is cleaning up our fuel supply. So you can see in 2005, we were heavily based on coal and natural gas with only 3% wind. Last year, we had reduced our dependence on natural gas, but we still own part of a coal plant down in Pueblo, Colorado. And you can see we're slowly starting to increase our wind. Now that we have our new renewable energy portfolio to go to, we are trying to increase our wind, and we've signed a contract to build a 100-megawatt wind farm outside of Lyman, Colorado. And that will provide us over 50% of our energy coming from wind. Do you know when the wind blows here in Colorado?
All night long.
And do you know when you're planning on charging your buses?
Overnight with our depot chargers.
So that's pretty cool. There's this synergy between when the wind blows here and when you guys are going to be able to charge your buses. As part of that, we're able to marry these two together, this wind-powered drive on wind, I call it, to power your buses.
So quick question, Chris. I heard Allison and Taylor allude to this previously, that there's quite a difference between the electrical demand and time of use. And so there have, maybe some of the people on this call have seen a couple other case studies where by not checking in with the utility previously, that it was a real shock when they got their first bill. So can you just quickly kind of go over that, the demand versus time of use for this project?
Yeah, I think it's very important to hit on the difference between demand and time of use. You know, demand refers to the amount of electrical power that's being consumed at any one point in time, as opposed to energy, which is the amount of power used in a period of time. Let's take a car, or in your case, a bus, for example. Energy is like the odometer, but in kWh, not miles. And demand is like the speedometer, measuring the speed at which energy is flowing. But demand in the electrical world, or the world I live in, is the maximum speed recorded per month. And those charges could add up. If we take your 6 depot chargers at 150 kW output each, if all those buses come in, you're looking at 900 kW. And that could result in $4,000 of just a demand charge the first night that those buses are charging.
Okay, so knowing that, then how significant, if you look down in the kind of the left side of the screen here above that bus, how significant is this special rate, this very proactive rate that Holy Cross is giving RFTA?
Yeah, so time of use is the ability to charge a different rate at a different point in time of the day. So as opposed to, you know, the maximum amount of draw you have per month in any 15-minute window like it was talked about before, this is just when are you charging and when are you not charging. It's a lot like going to the pump. And during a certain amount of time, your diesel would cost X amount of dollars. But during this window, which is 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. for us, the fuel costs more. So we came up with this rate, a time of use rate with no demand charge, because we knew you guys were going to charge at night. And we created an energy charge at 6 cents off peak and 24 cents on peak. And this allows you to still charge if you need to on peak, if it's an emergency or you need to get a bus out or there's some issue, but really kind of put the carrot out in front of you guys that, you know, there's some super cheap energy at night. The other thing that we're working on is oversupply. So oversupply is this word that when we buy too much energy or create too much energy, then we have places to put it. And that can even be more progressive. There could be a time of use oversupply rate that happens in the middle of the night when we forecasted more wind than we know what to do with. We might even be able to carry a cheaper rate onto you guys.
Okay, so let me ask you this, Chris. How could you, as Holy Cross, how could you just make this decision to change this rate? I'm sure a lot of people that are early adopters of electric transit would like this kind of a deal.
Yeah, it's, you know, for us, it's very hard to create a rate with no data. And being one of the first co-ops in our region to have a fleet of eight electric buses coming onto our territory and onto our grid, we didn't have a whole lot to compare it to other than Holy Cross was fortunate enough to feed 7 ski resorts. And at the ski resorts, it's a lot of the same load that you would expect from an electric bus, but with their snowmaking. It's a large load turning on in the middle of the night and shutting off early in the morning. So we took our snowmaking and used that as our data to provide a good rate for electrification of transportation, mostly with transit and school buses. Part of that's because we're a co-op in that we are managed by a board of directors. So we did a cost of service study last year with the Brattle Group, and in that we proposed to them to look at electric vehicles, mostly mass transit, and figure out what was a great rate that was fair for you, but also fair for our 43,000 other members, so that we weren't rate basing it. That's easy for us to do because we just show up in front of our board of directors and talk about why we think this rate is good, and we had the Brattle Group to back us up. But for somebody like Excel that also services you guys, they have a much longer process. They have to go in front of the Public Utilities Commission, known as the PUC, with their rate. They proposed a rate that's similar, but it's called a coincidental peak pricing rate, where they have a lower demand charge and then a time of use. And then occasionally, once a month, when everybody turns on electricity, we all pay what's known as a coincidental peak. So Holy Cross, for the amount of electricity we're using within that 1 hour, will pay money to our service or energy service providers that is equivalent or on the same time frame that everybody else peaks. So they're looking at a rate called an EVS, which would implement a critical peak pricing as part of that. So RAFT has been testing buses for 4 months now. Jason, how are they performing?
So they are in a test phase, and as I mentioned, we have 8 of them. We have temporary wraps on them. We're running them around the city of Aspen and shorter routes kind of closer to our maintenance facility and not getting too far out. So far, they're doing great. They are consistently going up and down the mountain grades, no problem. There has been a little bit of slippage on ice with the regenerative braking, but it's something that we are working on with our drivers. Another cool thing is that we have 360 Connect is the software that New Flyer provides, so it's basically the telematics, and our maintenance department and ops have really used this data. For example, with the heaters, all electric heat can really suck the battery on these, even more so than the air conditioning, sometimes using upwards of 30 to 40% of the range. And so we've noticed that we also have these diesel-fired auxiliary heaters on there. They're really small, and they are only used very, very strategically to kind of offset the electric heat. But we're going to have to give more priority to those, so that way we can preserve more of our battery to make it through the routes.
So we've also looked at school buses, which is the complete polar opposite to a transit bus. We've done the numbers of school buses docked or at the bus barn 91% of the time. That is almost a polar opposite to RAFTA. So you guys run how many hours a day?
We run about 22 hours a day as a transit agency. And so it kind of creates more of an active management of the battery electric buses. So instead of just filling it with diesel, washing it, parking it on the line, and walking away, these are going to have to be more actively managed within the off-peak time that Chris mentioned to get the special rate. And so yeah, it's kind of it's changing the way we do business, at least with these buses.
Yeah, and having a long duration for like a school bus to charge it is fairly easy to do. But for you guys, I mean, we're looking at 2 to 4 hours to charge this, and I think that was one of the great decisions of going with depot charging off the first 8 buses.
Yeah, and I will add that some of the folks might be wondering if we're using on-route charging. We are not right now, but we plan to do a full evaluation study of our 8-bus pilot project and look at where we can maybe strategically place a charger or a couple, and Holy Cross is going to be significant feedback on that as well, because they might incentivize us to put one at a different place on their grid.
Great. So are these buses have people on them yet, or are they running around?
They're running around. We do not have actual passengers on them yet, just some staff and different folks. But we hope to have them all in revenue service here in the RAFTA territory in late 2019.
That's super exciting. I think, some of the lessons learned from me was, to start those conversations early. And we've been at this for 2.5 years, and we're able to get in there and develop a rate. And then, the other thing I talk a lot about, besides the synergy of renewable energy and transit, is this 27 bus, right?
Yeah.
So for us, when we started looking at what it looked like to provide power to the 8 buses, my mind started wandering and looking at what it would take to provide more power to a lot more of the fleet. and I came up with this thing called the 27th bus, because at the 26th bus, we were good with coming out of the substation with power. But the second that you guys bought that 27th bus, we had to upgrade our transformer at the substation. So that's an expensive bus.
Right.
And I'm glad we're having those conversations now, so when you guys get to that 27th bus, we're prepared to know how that's going to work. What are some of your lessons learned from this project?
Communication, coordination straight away with internally. As I mentioned, it's kind of a paradigm shift. I think that our mechanics and our drivers, that they're seeing these buses and they're seeing kind of the cool factor, and that you know, with the data, we're going to have to do close analysis of whether they are more expensive or less expensive to operate. But the feedback on them so far is that everyone really likes the performance of them. And also just messaging, you know, external with our customers, letting people know kind of what these are and that they do cost more, but they're meeting some of our sustainability goals. And we hope that they'll perform on par, you know, on all of our routes. So that's kind of early in this process, that's kind of what I've learned so far.
So, you know, in the next month or so, when these buses go into operation, they'll drive around all day. How many miles do you think you're going to be able to drive? Let's say on a cold, snowy day. Let's call it worst conditions here.
We're aiming for somewhere between 125 and 150 miles per charge.
Yep.
And so what we'll probably end up having to do is, you know, do some incremental charging with some smart charging software at the depot, and that's going to be the learning curve of when to charge and how much. So, for example, bus 6 comes in, maybe it doesn't need 100% charge because it's only going to be going back out for another 2 hours. So it's going to be kind of tweaking that and working with the utility to find the smartest charging regimen that works best for our operations.
Great. Any last words to the folks out there?
No, we're available for Q&A whenever everyone's ready.
Great. Kara, handing it back over to you.
Okay, we're actually handing it back over to CTE, who has an additional part of the presentation, but that was great. A lot of excellent information and really good, you know, case study. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much for talking about your experiences. So we're just going to go through quick a couple of other types of rates and other things that utilities have done for their transit agencies, and then some strategies for reaching out before Q&A. So one of the things to keep in mind as we're looking at these rates is that every utility is different, just as every transit agency is different. And so the solution that works in one place might not work so well in another place. Talk about buses having a 12-year service life, electricity rates may or may not. So uncertainty in fuel prices is not anything that you are not used to. Diesel prices fluctuate daily, but another thing just to keep in mind is that we're seeing some pilots that are maybe like a 5-year pilot, and a lot of agencies that are in that utility service territory are like, well, but I have to buy my buses for 12 years. What are you going to do in year 6? And then capital versus operating funds. We've seen some utilities offering to put up money for infrastructure, make capital investments. They have the same questions about capital versus operating funds that you guys deal with. So another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at these different options. So before we go on, we've got polling question number 3. Curious to know how many of you are in a utilities service territory where they have an EV rate structure or pilot program. And I guess RFTA has 4 utilities, but most of you probably only have 1. Maybe 2. And that does go the other way as well. It's probably fairly obvious, but some utilities will have many, many transit agencies in their area. Others may only have 1 if they're a pretty small co-op or a municipal utility that only serves the area in their city.
Okay, for this one, we only had 9% yes, 32% no, and 59% I don't know. So we'll close that poll.
All right, yeah, and it is quite possible there are a lot of utilities that have EV rates in development. So maybe they have one coming, but it's not finalized yet. They're just starting out.
I lost my.
You lost your mouse. Okay. So there's utilities are providing support both on the infrastructure and on the rate side of things. So here's some examples for infrastructure support. So Austin Energy is supporting Cap Metro by helping out with the design for a large bus garage, bus depot, and how to do that. Portland General Electric, they paid for the charging infrastructure for TriMet. They basically were able to and TriMet was able to use that support to leverage their Lono funds to buy 5 buses instead of the 4 that they were originally planning for. And PGE is still being very much involved in that project by owning and operating the charging equipment. So one of the benefits to TriMet in this is that they're learning electric buses, which is its own thing on its own, in itself, but they're by the utility taking on owning and operating the charging equipment, TriMet doesn't have to also learn that while they are learning how to do electric buses. And another example, Burlington Electric, their transit agency said, we want to get a pilot bus, and the utility said, well, we'll help out. We'll help you with a temporary charging station for that bus while it's here for a demonstration. And then they continued to partner with their transit agency and worked with them on their Lono application to get funding for electric buses. And then on the rate side, we'll talk about a couple of things that are happening in California, and then we'll talk about some non-California things. So PG&E is, they're offering what they're calling a subscription model. So instead of a traditional demand charge, you basically are saying, this is how much charging capacity we need, and we'll pay a fixed rate based on that amount of power. So it's serving kind of a similar purpose, but it's coming at the question of what the customer's demand is, the agency's demand, in a different way. And then they're using time of use energy charges, like Chris was describing. SCE is doing a 5-year program where they're waiving all demand charges. They're basically saying we won't do any demand right now, and so the agency doesn't have to worry about it while they get their first electric buses. Although those demand charges, there's uncertainty as to how those will be implemented 5 years from now. And they are also using time of use energy charges. One of the things I want to mention here is that because they're not having demand charges, but they still have to deal with the costs of putting that sort of power demand on the grid. And so one of the ways that a utility can deal with that is by saying, okay, we're not going to do demand, but instead of paying, and I'm making this number up, but instead of paying 10 cents a kilowatt hour, we're going to charge you 15 cents a kilowatt hour. So they're basically recovering that cost through their energy charges instead of a demand charge like they normally would. And then a couple of other examples. So Hawaiian Electric, they're kind of an interesting case. So Hawaii has a ton of solar on their grid. It's a kind of a big challenge for them actually, with the amount of solar that they have. So their energy is cheapest in the middle of the afternoon when the sun is shining, and so they're offering an energy discount at that time, which is kind of opposite of what Holy Cross was saying, where they've got a ton of wind on their system, and so energy is much cheaper for them when the wind is blowing in the middle of the night. So depending on where you are, the time of use pricing scheme may be very different. Minnesota Power is they're doing something kind of interesting where they are keeping demand charges in, but they're telling the transit agency that if your demand is ever exceeding more than 30% of the utility bill, we're going to cap it because that is an undue burden on you, and we want to support your transportation electrification plans. So this is one way that we can provide support. And then Xcel Energy, I know Chris talked about that a little bit. This is Xcel Energy Minnesota. They may be doing something different than they are doing in Colorado. But one of the things they're looking at is saying, okay, after you've bought a certain amount of energy, we're going to give you basically a discount on every additional kilowatt hour that you buy. So there's a ton of, I guess kind of the point of going through all this is that there's a ton of different ways to look at designing rate structures, and nobody has figured out if there's a magic answer. We're not there yet, and there probably won't be. It's going to be very different for every situation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Taylor to talk a little bit about building a partnership with your utility.
Yeah, so the importance of building and maintaining strong relationships with your utility cannot be overstated. So we want to leave you with some tools and talking points to help foster those relationships. One of the first steps to building a partnership is to set up a kickoff meeting with your utility to discuss your current plans and goals for your ZEB deployments. You should also reach out to and build relationships with other transit agencies that are deploying or planning on deploying ZEBs. This allows you to share best practices learned and other experiences. It is important to note that large transit agencies will most likely be experiencing different types of challenges. So try to ensure you're building relationships with transit agencies that have similar operating characteristics as yourself. We do want to note that CTE runs the Zero Emission Bus Resource Alliance, or known as ZEBRA, which is an alliance of transit agencies that are deploying zero-emission buses. We have meetings to discuss best practices, the newest technologies, and research. If you're interested in learning more about this group and connecting with them, please reach out to me, Taylor at cte.tv, and I'll gladly send you some more information about that group. So back to having this kickoff meeting with your utility. You'll want to discuss your short and long-term goals. In regards to your short-term goals, you should chat about the pilot technology you will be deploying and how many buses, and your long-term goals should cover your timeline for transitioning your fleet, the type of bus technology you are considering utilizing, and the different phases of your transition deployment. These conversations should cover the type of charging or fueling technology you are considering and how much energy you will need. And make sure the conversations you're having with your utility not only cover your constraints, but also cover their constraints that they're operating under too. Ask about load profiles and potential time of use rates. Ask about capital investments that they can help you with or why they cannot help you with certain capital investments. And also make sure to review with them the source of energy generation or their source of energy generation and their future plans for energy generation. How renewable is their energy currently and how do they see this changing in the future? So CTE is hoping to do more work in this area to support building partnerships between utilities and transit agencies. So we're curious about what types of events or projects that would be beneficial or interesting to you. The next two polling questions ask about your interest in participating in a longer workshop on this topic or a smaller facilitated workshop between you and your utility. So polling question number 4, would you be interested in learning more about this topic during a half or full day workshop?
Most of the attendees say yes. 67% would like to, 12% might not like to, and 20% are unsure.
Great. And then we have polling question number 5. Would you be interested in a workshop with your electric utility?
I guess I'll just mention while you are answering the question that FTA is also very interested in ensuring that these partnerships are being built. They recognize the importance of working with utilities on transportation electrification. So this work is actually funded by an FTA research program where this is one of the functions components of that work. So.
And most of the attendees would also be interested in this. 71% yes, only 8% no, and 21% do not know if they would be interested.
Okay, great. So that is everything that we have prepared for today, and we would love to take your questions.
Okay. So we had quite a few questions today. I'm going to read them aloud. And okay, starting from the beginning. And then if there's time after that, we will take people with raised hands. So the first question, we have heard about burning garbage to create energy from burned garbage. Is that related to the electric vehicles you were discussing today?
I think we talked about this a little bit with the grid being a cleaner source of energy than other fossil fuel type things. I don't know of any particular transit buses that are fueled using electricity generated from waste to energy plants.
Yeah, this is Chris with Holy Cross. Yeah, we don't know of anything like that either, but we've been looking at composting operations. We do a lot of composting in the valleys and taking that up to the landfill and creating or capturing methane from that, and then burning the methane to create the power to provide fuel for the buses. So that's as close as we've gotten to investigating burning actual garbage, actually letting food digest and turn into methane gas.
And I'll just add on to that with the capturing methane. That is a source of renewable hydrogen. So a lot of hydrogen these days comes from reformation of natural gas. But if you get that natural gas from a renewable source, whether that through another source like biogas or something like that, that is a cleaner way to do a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle.
Okay. So we will be posting the questions and answers, and our panelists will have a chance to fully answer them after the session. But this is just so you sort of get a basic idea. So here's another question. How long do you run the electric buses? This is for Jason, I guess, during a typical day.
Yeah, this is Jason. So typical route that we're kind of running them on is they're lasting about 6 to 8 hours, and that depends on how many laps we're doing and like how short the entire route is. But in general, around 6 to 8, and we assume that eventually if we bring an on-route charger on, then that'll extend that dramatically, and we'll be able to keep that bus out longer. And
those are fairly short loops?
Yeah, those are pretty short loops. Those are probably maybe 15 loops at about 10 miles or so apiece. And so somewhere between, as I mentioned earlier, 125 to 150 miles is what we're seeing during our test phase right now, and recognizing that it's not dead of winter yet, but we have operated these on some pretty cold days so far.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, the next question. When buses are charged overnight, does that require staff to be present to move or charge the buses?
Yeah, this is Jason with RFTA again. The answer right now is yes. And the reason being is that we're working with ABB, who is the manufacturer of the actual chargers, and they will have some performance monitoring and like more smart charging software coming online. But right now, it is fairly manual. And one of the reasons why is that our maintenance guys are plugging those buses in right at 9:00 p.m. whenever the off-peak starts for Holy Cross. And so we're really trying to honor, doing that whenever we can. But we do think that once we have sequential charging, smart charging, some of the different software working for us, that it will remove some of the manual labor of chaining these together.
Yeah, and for us at Holy Cross, I think Jason kind of hit the nail on the head here. It's, we have this term called being a good grid citizen. And that means that you understand when to use electricity and when not to use electricity as a greater good, because we are a co-op made up of members. And they've done a great job with that. One of the things that I was not impressed with was what these charging manufacturers called smart chargers. For me, we have a program here called Charge at Home, Charge at Work, where we hand out level 2 chargers to our membership to put in their homes, because we know about 80% of charging is done in the home. And these chargers are pretty smart. From your smartphone, you can turn your charger off and on. But what we noticed with these smart chargers that were providing a lot of high capacity charging to buses is that they were able to read a lot of data, record a lot of data, but they really didn't have this feature to be able to turn them off and on at a scheduled time. So like Jason said, we've been working with ABB on what we're looking for and kind of providing specs for them to further develop their charging infrastructure.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, a lot of questions for people who are probably going to be using this. So another question, this is for RFTA again, how successful is your excess energy rate? The person wants to know that since you have a finite number of buses that already are on a schedule, can you take the power of excess energy?
Yeah, I mean, so these buses are consuming 2.4 megawatt hours a night. If you drive them from 100% down to about 20%, I guess I don't understand the question of excess energy. What we're trying to do is be able to forecast when we're going to have this oversupply or excess energy, and then build the smart charging into the buses so that they turn on at a forecasted time. We'll be able to forecast when energy excess, probably 24 to 48 hours in advance. So our first line of communications will probably just be sending RFTA emails saying, hey, instead of 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock tonight, you should really think about maybe plugging in at 2 or 1 a.m. in the morning, so we can really provide this true winter energy into your fleet.
Okay. And the next question, are buses located in mountainous areas able to run all day without stopping for a quick charge, or do you have to switch to another bus?
Yeah, so this is Jason. Just a disclaimer, as I said earlier, that we're not actually in revenue service, we're still in test phase, but what we're seeing so far is that the routes that we are operating these on, they are able to complete the whole route, and the buses will eventually have to head back to the maintenance facility because we only have depot charging right now. And it is our plan, because we have so many buses, because we have 8, let's say, instead of just 2, that we are going to have options of hopefully swapping electric with electric when need be. And so once the smart charging that Chris mentioned advances more, then we'll be able to chain those together and keep those fully topped off so whenever we need to just plug one in to the routes, we can. So, so as of right now, the buses are having to leave the route and go back to the depot charge. That might change later depending on the on-route charging.
Yeah, and there's a lot of similarities between, you know, a diesel or natural gas bus and how it performs in 0-degree temperatures on a cold winter day. An electric bus, I know we see it in light-duty cars too, that we get a drop in mileage due to the chemistry of a lithium-ion battery and how that wants to, you know, it's happiest at 70 degrees on a sunny day like most of us. So when it gets cold, it doesn't perform the same way. So yeah, we have a lot of data to collect over this winter and hopefully have some reports in the springtime for everyone to let everyone know how these buses do on those cold, dark days and what they can expect for performance.
And the question was specifically about mountains. Have you tested the buses on any mountainous areas yet?
Yes, we have several routes. We have several routes that do have some pretty steep grades, including in up around Aspen and Snowmass Village. Aspen Skiing Company operates 4 ski resorts, and we have tested these kind of running up to some of those ski resorts. And so I would say that yes, we're kind of kicking the tires, I guess you could say, to see what they will do and will not do. We have some ceiling and some basement data, and the answer will be somewhere in the middle of finding the optimum routes. So yes, we have ran them up some mountainous areas.
And what's that elevation gain between, you know, the Snowmass to Aspen, 600-700 feet?
Yeah, you're looking at probably the city of Aspen, like downtown, the elevation's about just shy of 8,000 feet above sea level, running it up to about 8,600 to 8,700 feet up in Snowmass. And so time will tell of where we can actually run these consistently all day long. But, you know, just the base elevation of 8,000 is a pretty big deal compared to what some others are running in California and other places. So.
Hi, this is Allison. I would just add a couple of things. One is that the range, the 6 to 8 hour day service day, is not significantly less than you would see in a flat area. And I would add that one of the challenges that can be exacerbated by being in a mountainous area is, Jason mentioned a little bit of slipping with regen. But some vehicles will, if they detect a slippery condition, they'll shut off the regenerative braking. So if you've gone up this hill and then you come back down on maybe on a summer day where there's no snow, you are able to take advantage of the regen and get some of that energy back. But if it's slippery and the bus shuts off the regen for safety reasons and you don't get that energy back, it can have a significant impact on your range. So some of that range variation can be exacerbated, I guess, in a more mountainous area versus a flatter area with the same kind of icy conditions.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully we got all of that in there. Okay, so the next question, and we're pretty close, so I think we're just going to finish up with the questions we already have. How feasible would solar energy on the transit facility work to fuel the chargers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that was kind of the next level of us. We wanted to focus on getting grants and purchasing the buses and working with Holy Cross up front. But we are definitely researching opportunities for local renewable energy offset. And sooner than later, it's probably going to end up being wind offset, which is what Chris mentioned. But the question of solar is also a good question. We're going to be doing feasibility of potentially putting some rooftop solar on our maintenance facility. One crux that we know of already is that it's not a great solar ready site with the clouds up around Aspen and the aspect of the building that it may not be an amazing site. There may be also another opportunity that to also add some renewable energy to their portfolio. Holy Cross is looking to develop a 5 megawatt solar farm in the Upper Valley near Aspen. That's going through land use approvals right now. And I'll just say when that comes online, because it's looking pretty good for it to happen, then RFTA kind of has a place in line to purchase, probably around a fifth of the production of that array to help offset or be net metered back to the increased electrical consumption at our maintenance facility. So wind probably more likely first, solar is a maybe, and then we'd have to probably look at some storage opportunities as well. And so we'll be taking lead from Holy Cross on a lot of that renewable energy questions. So.
Yeah, and just to, let's say you wanted to net meter your bus barn or your 8 buses that you procured, it would take a lot of land. For these 8 buses, my rough numbers is you would need 3 megawatts to provide that much energy for which they would use in a year. So that's acreage.
And 3 megawatts, I have in my mind that's about 15 acres of land. Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wonderful. And we are at 3:30. I'm going to actually answer the next questions. Are these video webinars being taped for later viewing? Yes. Are the PowerPoints going to be posted, emailed for later viewing? Yes. How to obtain a copy of the slides? I will send all the attendees an email about it. And you'll also get a course evaluation. Please give us your feedback. And thank you very, very much to Taylor, Allison, Jason, and Chris. You really covered a lot of excellent information. I can see everybody going out and wanting to deploy this themselves. It really seems like, something that would increase the environmental impact and really let's get going. So thank you all. Thank you to all our presenters and attendees, and we hope to see you at the next events that we do. Please check our website, please check our newsletter and our social media. Okay. Have a good day, everybody.